Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the papacy in the modern world with the next installment in the reign of Pope 256, Leo XIII. In 1896, a new man was appointed to French military intelligence named Lieutenant Colonel Georges Picquart, Picquart. He was troubled that all of the evidence used to convict a French-born Jewish officer named Dreyfus, Dreyfus, was written evidence. And on the basis of that, Dreyfus had been accused of and found guilty of treason. He was removed from the officer corps, degraded, as degradation was a formal, his his rank insignias were ripped off and the sword was broken. Then he was sent to a prison colony. So almost a year of investigating had not uncovered a single witness to a single meeting, or even a place of meeting, between Dreyfus and any German agent. So on his own initiative, he reopened the investigation to satisfy himself that Dreyfus was indeed guilty, because if not, then the spy was still around and presumably still spying for the Germans. Picquart soon became convinced that Dreyfus was innocent and that he was framed as a decoy to protect the real culprit, Major Ferdinand Esterhazy. Esterhazy was of Hungarian descent, but of a branch of that famous family that had settled in France during the 17th century. He was believed to be a count with independent wealth who served in the army out of a sense of patriotism and family tradition. But this was a cover for the hyperactive social life that centered around Esterhazy, and which had drawn well over half of the officers of the French general staff into considering themselves his personal friends. Esterhazy was a member of the general staff, as had been Dreyfus. But Esterhazy was in the infantry section, and so had not been suspected in the leak, because the secrets that were leaked regarded French artillery. So his social position, coupled with his connections, enabled him to gain informal access to information which an ordinary major would not have been able to obtain. When Picquart made his findings known, a wave of panic washed through the general staff, as so many realized that even if they were not knowingly guilty, they were known to be in Esterhazy's circle and would be tainted irreparably and possibly imprisoned themselves if he were convicted. This line of reasoning led to a cover-up framing Dreyfus, which was itself a cover-up of the deeper problems in the general staff. Picquart was silenced by being reassigned to a remote post in Algeria. A public charade was arranged in which Esterhazy demanded that his honor be cleared through a trial. This trial took place in 1898 and resulted in his immediate acquittal, after which he was given a pension and departed to live in retirement in England. Picquart's evidence that Dreyfus was framed was leaked to the French press, probably by Picquart himself. Dreyfus was still languishing in a hellish confinement in a hut on Devil's Island. And once it became public, he became the center of a national crusade for his exoneration. Those who took up his cause represented an alliance of those who genuinely wanted justice with anti-Catholics who would love nothing better than to present the majority Catholic officer corps as being, in a negative light, as being not only rife with traitors, but also willing to imprison an innocent man for life for a crime he didn't commit, specifically a Jewish man. With another part of the alliance was with those who were anti-military, just despised the military, and loved any occasion to discredit it, along with radicals who despised the Third Republic and wanted it replaced with a socialist or communist party state. The Public Crusade began on January 13, 1898, with a famous one-page article in L'Aurora, The Dawn, written by the famous novelist, journalist, who was a socialist also, by the way, Émile Zola, Z-O-L-A. And the article was titled simply, J'accuse, I accuse. Zola was arrested for this. He was put on trial for criminal libel, and since he was accusing the military, therefore, it was treason. And he was convicted the following month, on February 23rd. He only evaded imprisonment by leaving the country for England, where he continued his writing campaign unfettered. The war in the newspapers of France spread to the newspapers of Europe and America. In France, the conservative papers, which were invariably Catholic and monarchist in their sympathies, defended the honor of the army and therefore the legitimacy of Dreyfus's conviction. These papers, in the heat of controversy, published in writing an embarrassing stream of anti-Jewish rhetoric, which later came back to haunt them. Because so many members of the officer corps were Catholic aristocrats, several of the French bishops fell into the trap of becoming involved in politics yet again. They just hadn't learned their lesson. And they published editorials in the newspapers stating that since Jews had betrayed Christ, it was no surprise that a Jew would betray France. The public outcry was so extreme, even being the cause of episodes of street violence, that the government ordered the military to hold a retrial. In September of 1899, the third military tribunal, third in the sense, the first wrongfully convicted Dreyfus, the second was the cover-up that exonerated Esterhazy. So now this is the third. Found Dreyfus guilty again, but with, quote, with extenuating circumstances, unquote. This meant that without the fabricated evidence against him, the charges against Dreyfus could not meet the standard necessary for conviction. But they refused to admit that the previous military tribunals were wrong. So they commuted Dreyfus's sentence from life in solitary confinement to 10 years in prison. Since he had already been in prison 6 years, since his initial arrest in 1893, this meant that Dreyfus only had to serve another 4 years for a crime he didn't commit. The same day that this preposterous verdict was announced, there was a large-scale riot in the streets. In the size and the violence of the riot was due to the radical socialists who hoped to use the instability as a means to topple the Third Republic and replace it with a socialist government. The government summoned the troops, activated the army, declared martial law. In the hope of ending the scandal without humiliating the army, Dreyfus was given a pardon the week after his second conviction. So legally, this meant the government recognized his conviction as valid, but was releasing him from prison for humanitarian reasons. Dreyfus accepted the pardon just to get out of that horrible. He was in Guyana, in the prison. The possibility it got out of there as opposed to 4 more years there. His friends and supporters, in particular his brother, continued to wage a legal fight on his behalf, but the conviction was not annulled until July 12, 1906. Dreyfus then lived in quiet retirement until France was invaded by Germany during the First World War. In staggering turn of events, he volunteered once again to serve in the army, and he did. So it was not until after Germany was defeated and the German monarchy was overthrown and replaced by the Weimar Republic, which opened the records of the Kaiser's secret intelligence services. Then it was proven absolutely that Dreyfus was totally innocent and that Esterhazy had been employed by German military intelligence. He was an agent handled by the military attaché in France, Maximilian von Schwarzenkoppen, and that he was essentially on the German payroll, receiving 2,000 Deutschmarks a month. The effect of the Dreyfus scandal on the church in France was devastating. Radicals, having failed to overthrow the government, still vented their hatred on the church. In July of 1901, they put forward the Law of Religious Associations, which would have placed all church property, churches, hospitals, rectories, monastery, the school, seminaries, the schools had already been stolen, but the other property would have placed them under the control of lay associations. So these associations would then be responsible for paying the salaries of the clergy or withholding their salaries. And they would have control over all the functions in church, including the sacraments. And they would decide who could or could not live on the church property, like in the rectory. So they would have, they could put a priest out, if he said something they didn't like. Now, the conservatives had enough support from moderates to stop this law for the moment. Skip that. Yeah, we covered that already. In 1897, a French-language biography was published of an American Catholic priest named Father Isaac Hecker. And I go into much more detail about this in the American History series, which is a separate playlist on this. But it was based on originally an English language biography of Hecker written by a Paulist priest. Father Isaac Hecker founded the Paulist, the Society of St. Paul. And the biography was written by one of his spiritual sons, another Paulist priest named Father Walter Elliot. Eliot's original biography was too long in detail for French audiences, as it detailed Hecker's many parish missions traveling around the country. But in the 1897 French book was a summary of Eliot's work rather than a translation, though it was generally regarded at the time as an actual translation. The introduction was written by the Archbishop of St. Paul, Minnesota, who was an Irish immigrant to the United States, Archbishop John Ireland. A preface to the work was composed by a French priest named Father Felix Klein, who was a scholar priest. He was on the faculty of the Institut Catholique in Paris. He was a liberal Catholic and a modernist, And so in his preface, it included an overly enthusiastic appraisal of the effect which he believed Isaac Hecker's thought could have on Europe in general and France in particular. Klein seriously proposed that Hecker's teaching could transform Europe and lead it finally into a synthesis of secular and sacred which had eluded the West since the end of the Middle Ages. Now you can refresh your memories by watching the American multiple videos talking about this whole development of Americanism, which was ultimately condemned as a heresy, and this is why I'm mentioning it now, because Leo's the one who did it. So Isaac Hecker, just to summarize, refresh your memory, he regarded the United States, with its constitutional separation of church and state, and freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. He regarded that as God's will, as an act of divine providence, which freed, the immigrants who came from elsewhere to the United States, freed them from the shackles of their past, the centuries-long, in some cases millennia-long, conflicts from their places of origin, and then they could start anew. And he thought that was an ideal to be pursued. Therefore, that the United States system, with its separation of church and state, freedom of religion, all of that was an ideal to be pursued. That was contradicting the teaching of multiple popes, most notably Gregory XVI, who in 1832 condemned liberal Catholicism, defined in that way, condemned liberal Catholics in the 19th century definition of that as those who promoted freedom of religion, separation of church and state, freedom of the press, freedom of conscience, as an ideal to be pursued. And since freedom of religion was understood by conservative Catholics, separation of church and state was understood by conservative Catholics to mean that religion should be quarantined from public life, that amounted to, in the eyes of the critics of Hecker and Americanism, as saying that the church should teach as an ideal its own irrelevance, its own banishment from public society. Now, this biography being published in France, in French, with a preface like this from Klein, because Klein was one of those who he was one of those. He was a priest, parasiting off the church, got his education for free from the church, and got his income from the church as a priest and teaching at a Catholic university. Yet he was one of those who believed in a secular republic. He thought that would be better, that was superior to a Catholic monarchy. And his preface presented this biography as pointing the way, that this was the way. This was the way for us to go in France. So immediately, a conservative monarchist, another French priest who was a conservative monarchist named Father Charles Magnen, Maignen, began publishing a series of articles ridiculing the book and lampooning Isaac Hecker, who was deceased by this point. Hecker died in 1888, and heaped rhetorical venom on Klein and liberal Catholics. He collected these articles and had them published in book form under the title, Father Hecker, Is He a Saint? No, which is, the title continued the sarcasm, presenting Hecker as reviving the heresies of Pelagianism, as well as Illuminism, which held that direct revelation from God into the individual soul made the institutional church obsolete. Now, to be fair, that is a misrepresentation. Hecker, Hecker did not go that far. But anyway, before we get to that's 1897. The book was published, and the publishing war was going on in France. The next year, 1898, the Spanish-American War occurred, and also go into more detail on this in the American history course. But as far as its effect on Europe and the church in Europe, it started. Nothing just happened. So the war did not. The trigger was Cuba, the island of Cuba, off the coast of the United States. Cuba was a colony of Spain. Spain was still a monarchy, officially a Catholic monarchy. In 1895, the population a significant portion of the population of Cuba began fighting for their independence from Spain, to secede from the Spanish Empire and be independent, just as the United States had done, wage war in Great Britain to secede from the British Empire and become independent. Stories of atrocities routinely appeared in American newspapers, resulting in vocal demands for American intervention. The executive officer of the country was the 25th president, William McKinley. Born in Ohio, 1843, served as president from 1897 until his assassination in 1901. McKinley did not want to intervene. He was an isolationist in the George Washington, model: commerce with all, entanglements with none. Also, McKinley was the last veteran of the American Civil War to be elected president. So he did not want any more fighting in his life. So he resisted the pressure until an American warship, the USS Maine as in the state of Maine, was dispatched to Havana, Cuba, ostensibly to protect American interest and to evacuate any Americans still on the island who wished to be evacuated. On February 15, 1898, the USS Maine sank after a mysterious explosion. The Spanish believed that the Americans deliberately detonated a charge in order to fabricate casus belli, a cause for war, while Americans believed that that the Spanish sank. It was a mine, that the Spanish sank it. Regardless, this triggered the war. The war was waged between the United States and Spain from April to August of 1898, culminating in victory for the United States. In the concluding treaty in December of 1898, Spain ceded to the United States control of 4 of its colonies: the island of Cuba, the island of Puerto Rico, both of those in the Caribbean, then in the Pacific, the island of Guam, and the archipelago, the Philippine archipelago, which is many, many islands. Those last two acquisitions, the reason I'm mentioning this, those last two acquisitions, Guam and especially the Philippines, brought the United States into what Japan regarded as its sphere of influence in the Pacific. It is therefore not surprising that when World War II began, Japan directed an attack against the American bases on the Philippine Islands. Further, the defeat of Spain in 5 months, that's all the war took, a 5-month war, was startling to Europe and the Vatican. Spain was a Catholic country, completely shamed in a war against a Protestant country. Now, officially, the United States was, not religious, was secular, but the Vatican never did believe American claims of separation of church and state, and just viewed the United States as a Masonic, a Protestant Masonic republic. Further, American prelates, American bishops, not every single one, but for the most part, not only supported the war, supported their own country against a Catholic country, but were very loud in their denunciation of Spain, and some even sold bonds to fund the war effort. To Roman ears, to Vatican ears, this went far beyond simple obedience to civil authority, and represented bishops publicly siding with Protestants against Catholics in a purely political and economic conflict that resulted in loss of life. That was the last straw. Americanism would be condemned as a heresy 1 month after the treaty was signed. The treaty was signed in December of 1898. December 10th, the Treaty of Paris. And so Americanism was condemned the following month on January 22nd, 1899. And the document was an apostolic letter. Testem benevolentiae nostrae, witness our goodwill. And so by condemning Americanism, Leo was not condemning the United States or the American people or patriotism. He was condemning Americanism in terms of a warning to resist the temptation of allowing a secular notion of civil liberties to undermine the timeless truth of faith. So one exemplar quote, "We, indeed, have no thought of rejecting everything that modern industry and study has produced. So far from it that we welcome to the patrimony of truth and to ever-widening scope of public well-being whatsoever helps toward the progress of learning and virtue. Yet, all this, to be of any solid benefit, nay, to have a real existence and growth, can only be on the condition of recognizing the wisdom and authority of the Church." Leo specified that he was responding to opinions expressed in the French translation of Hecker's biography. So he stipulated he was not condemning Hecker personally. Hecker was deceased, so he couldn't defend himself. He died 11 years earlier in 1888. So Leo extracted from all the publishing that went on after the French translation of the biography was published. Leo extracted some beliefs and condemned those as Americanism, rather than condemning Hecker personally. Nevertheless, Hecker is the father of Americanism. So, prohibited beliefs are, first, that the Holy Spirit is more active in the present age, meaning their age, than in the past. That belief is forbidden. That the Holy Spirit plays favorites with time periods. Second, it is forbidden for Catholics to believe that direct inspiration of the Holy Spirit into individual souls eliminates the need for spiritual direction, spiritual guidance by the Church. Third, Catholics are forbidden to believe that the active virtues are superior to the passive virtues. Virtue is virtue. Fourth, Catholics are forbidden to believe that religious vows are obsolete in this new age, meaning their age, 1899, because religious vows inhibit liberty. Fifth, Catholics may not believe that the Church needs new methods to adapt the message to their age. Remember, we covered that before. The Church can adapt the method of teaching the message, but the message cannot be altered, because then that becomes heresy. Sixth, Catholics are forbidden to believe that the Church in America should be different than the rest of the world. We can acknowledge that it is, but not that that's an ideal to be pursued. 7, Catholics are forbidden to believe that individual liberty should be introduced into the Church, freeing it from the monarchical model of authority by divine right. So Leo left it at that. Hecker is not personally condemned, nor did Leo state that Hecker believed every single one of all 7 of these things. So he's saying that these 7 things, he said, were attributed to Hecker in the French biography, French translation of that biography, but it wasn't really a literal translation, it was a paraphrase. So he said those were attributed to him, so these 7 things are errors, and he left it at that. And so Americanism, defined as meeting those 7 criteria, is still condemned. So, that condemnation stands. So Catholics still may not believe those things. But Americanism in the sense of patriotism and loving our country, that is not forbidden to Catholics. Okay, 1899. Now this is more secular history, but we're moving into it's relevant, as you'll see. The United States, I should say, the open door policy, as it was called, the open door policy was formulated by the American Secretary of State, John Hay, Hay, who lived from 1838 to 1905. And he had been a secretary to Lincoln when he was a young man. The open door policy was one in which the United States demanded equal trading rights and equal access for United States commerce to foreign countries. Now, in 1899, it was directed specifically toward China. China existed officially at that point as an empire, as a monarchy, as a hereditary monarchy, the Empire of China. But de facto, China had been divided into spheres of influence by Japan, as well as the Japan and the ascendant powers of Europe, England, France, Germany, and now the United States wanted a peace. The United States had just entered into the Pacific theater by acquiring the former Spanish colonies of the Philippine archipelago and the island of Guam from the Spanish-American War, and so they wanted a peace of China. But Chinese policy officially restricted that because the government had already made deals dividing up China into these spheres. So the open door policy was trying to breach that firewall, so to speak. Following year 1900, enter a new century, and it was officially a holy year. In preparation for it, Leo promulgated another encyclical on the Sacred Heart, titled Annum Sacrum, Holy Year, May 25th, 1899. An exemplar quote from number 8. Since there is, in the Sacred Heart, a symbol and a sensible image of the infinite love of Jesus Christ, which moves us to love one another, therefore it is fit and proper that we should consecrate ourselves to his most sacred heart, an act which is nothing else than an offering and a binding oneself to Jesus Christ, seeing that whatever honor, veneration, and love is given to this divine heart is really and truly given to Christ himself. And seminarians, a catechism has a section on the Sacred Heart, number 478. And biblical foundation for this devotion from the Old Testament, the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, verse 5, describes the suffering servant as being pierced for our transgressions. And the New Testament, the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verses 31 to 34, recounts that blood and water that when he was on the cross and the soldier, stabbed him with the spear, that blood and water came from his heart, from his side. Well, it'd be this side. One year, in 1900, 1 year after the open door policy, was China, the population in China reacted, not the government, but the population, with the Boxer Rebellion. All right, Boxer, in the American term, that means one thing, but it had a broader meaning in this case. So the Boxer Rebellion in China was an uprising of Chinese, what we would call working class, working class Chinese, farmers, peasants, as they would have been called, against the growing number of Westerners settling in China and exploiting China. So the term Boxer was a Western term, and the Western press described them as boxers. And that's derived from a simplistic understanding of traditional Chinese martial arts schools. Now, while students in such schools were not the only Chinese to engage in anti-Western violence. A disproportionate number were, because those in the martial arts schools were the most devoted to traditional Chinese life, the heritage of China. And therefore, they would be the ones most offended by Western encroachment. The Boxers, as they were called, were achieving frightening success in this anti-Western uprising. So in June of 1900, Western powers, Great Britain, the United States, Germany, and France, dispatched regular army troops, invaded China. Now the Boxers had made the mistake that many other indigenous peoples had in that time period by underestimating the destructive power of modern weaponry, gunpowder weaponry, such as the Maxim gun, which we covered, the automatic action, or machine gun, as we'd say. So this alliance of Western powers invaded China, captured Beijing, which then they were calling Peking, but it's Beijing, and sacked the city in August of 1900. 1901. Back to the United States, and this is a secular thing, but it's relevant to the modern world. A Connecticut-born businessman named John Pierpont Morgan lived from 1837 to 1913. In 1901, he organized U.S. Steel as a corporation. So, the significance being, steel does not occur in nature. Steel is a combination of iron and carbon, heated to 2,900 degrees Fahrenheit to create an alloy. Low alloy steel, meaning less than 8% carbon, is hard and used in machine parts and bridges. High alloy steel, meaning more than 8%, is ironically more malleable, but has other properties, notably stainless steel. Carbon, the element that has to be mixed with iron to make this, carbon is a non-metallic element that occurs in nature. It's diamonds, graphite, coal, charcoal. So those come together. Now, this 1901 U.S. Steel, of course, they wouldn't have known it in 1901, but we know that this is the beginning of the American industrial machine. Which owing to our involvement in 2 world wars, placed us in an ascendant position, certainly for the second half of the 20th century. Now we're into the 21st century, and things are, who knows. Same year, another component of the Industrial Revolution, 1901, oil drilling begins in North America. Now, petroleum products occur in nature, and they had been known and used for thousands of years in the ancient world. But the beginning of what we know as the oil industry, the petrochemical industry, began further back in 1859, when a retired railroad conductor named Edwin L. Drake drilled a steam-powered drill into the ground in a field outside of Titusville, Pennsylvania, and struck oil. Prospectors then combed the nation looking for more, and they found it. So with that background, no, nothing just happened. So 1901 did not just happen. So with that 40 years of background, in 1901, the first North American gusher was drilled and was in Spindletop Field in eastern Texas. Soon, railroads connected oil production with oil refining and oil distribution. Another key element of the modern age was thereby installed or came into being. The following year, 1902, back to France, was an election year in France. The elections returned a legislative majority of radicals meaning anti-Catholic, well, anti-religious, but in the French for our interest, anti-Catholic is the most significant, led by the 69th Prime Minister, Émile Combes, Combes, who lived from 1835 to 1921. Under his leadership, the radicals acted on their long-cherished dream of crushing the church. Émile Combes was born in southern France. His family was solid Catholic middle class. He attended seminary because that was his family, his family sent him into the church. That was, we've seen that pattern since the very first seminary and since the very first course you had with me. Because it was his family's dream to become a priest, that he become a priest. But in seminary, he lost his faith. Because for reasons we've covered, the French seminaries were infected by rationalism, Gallicanism, modernism. So he became, a seminarian who hates the priesthood, a Catholic who hates Catholicism, and then an ex-Catholic. He withdrew from seminary before ordination. His family then disowned him. And for the rest of his life, he manifested a violent, visceral anti-clericalism and anti-Catholicism. But he had to make a living, so he went to medical school. But after a brief attempt at practicing medicine, decided instead to devote himself to radical politics. He served in many offices in government before being elected on the wave of anti-clericalism following the Dreyfus Affair. And so in April of 1802, his group, his party achieved the ascendancy, and he was prime minister. In October of 1902, the radicals in the legislature abandoned pushing for the law of associations, which we covered earlier, and instead set up a commission to examine the Concordat of 1801, which was the treaties, well, three treaties, three documents, three agreements, establishing the relationship between the church and state in France. And this October 1902 commission was to examine abrogating, severing the Concordat, severing relations with the Holy See, and officially separating the church and state in France, in imitation of the the United States model. For the next 3 years, 2 parallel courses of action were pursued by anti-clericals. First, some wanted to pursue the law of associations, to place the church under the total control of the laity. Second, others wanted the church destroyed and assumed that without tax money to pay clergy salaries, which was part of the Concordat, that the church would simply disappear. At the same time, loyal Catholics pursued 2 parallel courses of response. First, some felt that they could finesse the law of associations by ensuring that friendly laity would control the boards. Second, others were tired of fighting with the government and for their own reasons wanted total separation of church and state, because even if that meant forfeiting the financial security of being on the payroll, it would at least give the church independence. On December 2nd, 1902, 2 months after the Commission on Separation was created, the priest-hating Prime Minister, Émile Combes, decided to toy with the church. He announced that he, as Prime Minister, had the right to appoint bishops to French dioceses without consulting or receiving approval from the Vatican. This was a direct contradiction of the Concordat of 1801, which provided for the Turner system, submit 3 names to the Vatican to fill vacancies, and then the Pope would choose. But now Combes didn't care who was bishop anywhere. So he made this announcement in the spirit of a boy who, pulls wings off a butterfly just to be cruel, or stir up throw a spider on an ant pile to see how long it takes him to eat him up, just to be petty. The following year, 1903, December 17th, history changed again. 2 brothers, Wilbur and Orville Wright, spelled with a W, W-R-I-G-H-T, they were bicycle mechanics actually, so this was a hobby of theirs, but they achieved the first powered flight. in the Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina, near the village of Kitty Hawk. Orville flew for 12 seconds. Wilbur flew for 59 seconds. History changed. Pope Leo XIII died the same year, July 20th, 1903, so he actually died before the flight, after a reign of a quarter century. Neither Ultramontanes nor liberal Catholics were happy. So we'll see what happens next. We move into the reign of the next pope. So for now, which we'll cover in the next video. So for now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.